Hi, I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies, from broadband to blockchain. Today, AI is promising to transform our world. But AI needs accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's developed and deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Holistic AI was one of the earliest companies built specifically to govern, audit, and red team AI systems. In this episode, co-founder and CEO Emre Kazim talks about how his original thesis, that AI governance would look like data governance, anchored in compliance regimes, has given way to something he now thinks looks more like cybersecurity, driven by incidents, technical assessments, and an arms race between AI capability and AI oversight. We also get into why human in the loop is no longer viable as the primary means of addressing AI risks, the vanguard model of enterprise AI adoption, why best practices will become the de facto standards for responsible AI, and why he believes that meaningful research capacity will be the price of entry for anyone working in the AI governance space. All right, Emre, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me, Kevin.
So you co-founded Holistic AI in 2020, if I'm right. That was before there was ChatGPT, before the EU AI Act. There was a lot of activity around responsible AI, but things have changed a lot. So what is it that originally got you started that made you see the need for this kind of service?
Kevin, that's actually a great question because it's been so long now since we got going. That sometimes when you look back in retrospect, you start to realize how many different kind of events precipitated certain kind of responses and other events which we kind of foresaw and predicted and so on and so forth. So let me give you a bit of a primer in terms of how Holistic AI spun out and what our kind of origin story is. So I'm co-founder of the company, and I co-founded the company along with Adriano Koshiyama. So Adriano and I met in the computer science department of University College London. So I'm sure your listeners are familiar with UCL. It's the home of DeepMind, Google's DeepMind. I claim Hinton as one of our Nobel Prize winners, but certainly Demis. Everyone was at UCL. And there was a lot of interest in foundational AI work, in the generation of synthetic data and so on and so forth. And in that context, there was an emerging and a very important conversation about trust, which was, if we're going to use these systems and meaningfully harness their potential, then we have to have confidence in those systems. So Adriano was doing his PhD at the time. I think Adriano started in 2018. I met him, but he started before then. I started my postdoc in 2018. That's when I ended up at UCL. And the general conversation that we were having at that time was, how do we engender trust in algorithmic systems? And the use case that we were focused on was the example of a trading algorithm. The company was called Might Capital. Kevin, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this use case. So it was a trading algorithm that glitched. And I think it wiped out $440 million from the business. So it was this huge...
Now I recall, yes, yeah.
It was this huge kind of use case in financial services. And there was this awareness that, okay, look at how mission critical these AI systems are. We have to have confidence that these systems actually work and they're reliable and safe and so on and so forth. What was interesting is that at the same time, that was very much about operations, but at the same time, a social awareness was emerging around issues of bias and explainability. So we weren't sure, okay, how are we going to go about doing this? And we thought our original thesis was that if we create a certification standard and an algorithm meets that standard, then it is, ergo, trustworthy. Now, the issue was, what kind of certification standard? What was the standard that we were going to generate? And also, why were we in a position to forward that standard? So what we did as academics, we had the power to convene, and we brought the great and the good in the UK together. So that we had regulators, we had the civil service bodies, and then we had industry, and then we had ourselves as academics. And we thought, okay, what we'll do is create a certification standard that all of this cohort or group agree to, and then we'll kind of publish it as a public statement, and then we can get going. And what happened pretty quickly is we realized that certification is an endpoint rather than a starting point. And the whole problem got flipped on its head. And two streams emerged. One was conversations about setting up a kind of national synthetic data center. And we were going to basically set up something where you could test your algorithms against these data sets, and then you would know if they were biased or whatever it was, because we knew the data wasn't. So you'll be able to test the actual algorithms against that. And the second work stream was what we referred to at the time as algorithm auditing, which was saying, okay, let's just take a single system and let's say, how does one go about auditing an algorithm? And what does it even mean to audit an algorithm? So Adriano led the paper. I was second name author on this. And he wrote, what I consider to be the foundational text in the field, which is Towards Algorithm Auditing. And the paper Towards Algorithm Auditing became a really powerful framework to say, okay, this is how we would theoretically go about assessing an algorithm. And the core thesis was there were technical variables such as explainability, privacy, bias, and robustness. And robustness was a kind of umbrella term for reliability, reproducibility, security, and so on. And that those technical verticals, we will call them verticals or variables, were controlled for by just like good traditional governance, documentation, compliance, taxonomies of responsibility, accountability, and so on and so forth. And then that was the kind of core thesis. Now, the problem is you can't study medicine in the library. You study medicine in the hospital. And Adrian and I were like, okay, if we're actually going to have impact, we've got to do this in the real world. So we spun the company out and we got going. And what we started to do was say, okay, how does one go about, in quotes, auditing an algorithm? And we use this language of auditing because we wanted to evoke a kind of seriousness within the community, because AI ethics and responsible AI quickly became quite fluffy as terms. So we were trying to make an analogy, say, hey, this is as serious as financial auditing, even though the analogy is not that great. So the kind of concept and the term changed and morphed, and we can talk about that perhaps, into things like, is this AI GRC? Is this AI compliance? Is this AI governance? And so on and so forth. But actually the core of it was, this is the foundational problem of this space, which is we can't have all this technology, but if we can't use it, what's the point? And how can we create the kind of confidence and trust in that? And that moved from an academic exercise to, maximizing our impact through a business.
Fast forward to today then, what has remained of that initial vision and what's changed?
So I think one thing that's changed is I think at the start, I believed that what we had, and I still believe this thesis, which is that the 2010s was defined by data and the 2020s have been defined by AI. A little primer here, I think the 2030s are probably going to be defined by robotics. And which is this kind of greater and greater embodiment or autonomy of systems. And I thought that the way that data, a primary way in which data was governed was through legislation. And for example, we had the GDPR, and the GDPR created a huge market. I think that that was ultimately wrong. I think it has not turned out to be the case. I think the EU AI Act is not a direct, comparison to GDPR. I think AI does something else. And I think that the AI governance space and market, if you will, is going to be defined more in analogy to cybersecurity than to governance in the way, than to compliance in the way that I thought it was going to be. Now,
that's really interesting. Could you say more what that analogy means?
So let's say, I always thought, okay, what is AI? Let's call it now AI governance. That's the category. And when you're doing category creation, it doesn't exist. You have to think, okay, what are the closest analogies here? And I thought about, a bunch of ways. One way I thought about was, okay, we've had cloud transformation and then we got cloud governance. Does this look like that? We had data transformation and then we got data governance. And when you look at data governance, yes, there's things like provenance, there's things like privacy, there's not compliance and privacy is not the sum total of data governance, of course. There's just a whole regime there. And then there's cybersecurity, right? Which is a different kind of problem and a different form of governance, if you will. And my thesis was of this cohort, that this would look more like data governance. And a big part of data governance, notwithstanding not in its totality, is compliance, was the GDPR. And actually, I thought AI is a companion or sister to data, that it has such an intricate relationship with the two, that it's more likely to be the AI governance, whatever this cashes out as, is more likely to be closest to data governance. In
And
fact, we had
presumably
to make
that was the thesis of the European Commission as well
absolutely,
in putting together the AI Act.
absolutely. So a couple, we wrote a lot of papers on this. Like right at the start in 2020, I believe the EU published their two principles upon which they were going to govern or legislate for AI, and it was ecosystem of competitiveness and an ecosystem of trust. And I thought, okay, yeah, these are the legal frameworks and so on. Now, the cybersecurity side, it didn't seem to have the kind of implications of privacy. Of like things like bias, explainability, a lot of the concerns, the social concerns that people were. It was more like, okay, the company needs to be protected from certain kinds of incidents, if you will. But as we've moved, and Kevin, be keen to hear your views on this. As we've moved, it feels like it's moving more and more into incident management, performance management, rather than, oh my God, we've got this compliance thing that we need to tick off. And, we need a bunch of people with legal and policy backgrounds. So it feels to me like that's where it is becoming more technical.
Interesting.
Incidentally, for us, Kevin, it's actually a good thing because we come from foundational research.
Yeah.
And it turns out to be non-trivial to red team an algorithm, or to really think about what are the latest benchmarks or how can we innovate in this space. But yeah, I think it's moving more into the deeper tech space than I think people had anticipated, or even I had anticipated.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So that's what I was going to ask you is what would be different for organizations taking this cybersecurity mindset, or for a company like yours that's providing these services, compared to where you started, and many people started, was this is like auditing. We've got a whole literature and experience and infrastructure around financial auditing. So what does it look like in practice now?
I think a couple things. One thing is it's not an extension of data governance. Ergo, it's not just adding a few questions to your data governance regime. So it has a huge implication in terms of who owns this within the business. I think secondly, the skill set of the kind of people who are involved in that kind of concern is very different. So it's not so much legal and policy. I think it's now going to become more and more technical, or people with technical kind of literacy and so on and so forth. I think the third thing is that it at the core of this, of the, let's say, the problem of governing AI is data governance is quite conservative, right? It's about conserving, protecting, ensuring a certain kind of regime of protection, if you will. Whereas AI fundamentally is about the exploitation and opportunity that it presents, right? So companies are racing to adopt AI, and almost like the winners of that race are going to win the market generally. So you have this immense pressure to say, we need to use these systems. So the governance aspect is actually about saying, how can we ensure as quickly as possible we can get the rockets off the ground? It's not just about protecting from the outside. Okay, let's make sure no one can access this and so on and so forth. So I think it's much more technical. So like I thought the market would have landed more on documentation and reporting. So we expect, and I think a lot of vendors just emerged and did that basically. We provide documentation, we provide, yeah, sure, so does everybody else, but actually at the core is saying, can you interrogate the systems themselves? So I've been looking at two concrete examples. One is our thesis on human oversight. So, Kevin, you remember, I'm sure, it used to be the kind of panacea for everything. We just make sure you have human oversight, or there's more human oversight.
Yeah.
And
everyone always says, human in the loop. That's the answer. I still hear that all the time.
And then it's like, we've got this elephant in the room, which is, in what meaningful way can a human let's say with these agentic systems, meaningfully oversee such a system, you know? And then you've got this kind of deeper problem of the systems are so sophisticated and dynamic that what about real-time monitoring? Like, what does it mean to actually have oversight? So that's an aspect that has been significantly eroded, I believe. The second part is the actual, what does it mean to assess? And I strongly believe that it requires meaningful technical assessment of the system. So not just ask. So if you remember for example, the data protection impact assessments would just be a form that someone filled in. It's just simply, it's just inadequate for these systems.
What exactly are those technical capabilities? You mentioned red teaming before, but give us a little bit more detail about what that means in practice.
So we'll take a few examples. Let's say you looked at, there was a piece of work that we did. I'm happy to say it was on explainability of agentic systems. Really cool piece of work, actually, Kevin. We won a prize. We were awarded this prize by one of the co-founders of OpenAI. It was a hackathon, actually. 600 teams competed. And it was just about this really cool, we called it agent graph. Anyone can find it on our website, and it's part of our product. And it was basically an explainability function or tool for agentic systems. And, that's the kind of stuff that really comes out of the academy. It comes from foundational research. It's bleeding edge. It's the kind of stuff which is, it's not meaningful to just ask a few heuristic questions and say, who made this decision, or, what was this output? It's about actually, can you interrogate this system technically? So that's one example. And then there's like a whole suite of, so you've got a social definition of bias, let's say, but then you've got a whole suite of technical tests to assess bias. Of course, nothing can be done in a vacuum. Each one is contextualizing the other, but you do need to assess these technically. So we have a large open source bias or debiasing library. So these are the kinds of things that I'm referring to. We still now industriously publish in leading computer science or AI conferences and journals because we think fundamentally that's probably where the direction of travel is. And we believe in it as well.
Mm-hmm. How much of a discontinuity is there with those technical responses with generative AI? Because, for example, there's a lot of bias testing algorithms which have been around now for a decade, but when you've got a non-deterministic system, then it's a somewhat different environment.
Yeah, totally. So that's an interesting question. And if I may, Kevin, I'd love to indulge a little bit about this kind of drama with the standards and regulatory bodies in our ecosystem writ large. So I think we were desperate as a community to say, somebody come out with the framework that we can that will be our target to assure against, right? And I think what happened was, rightly so, things were moving so quickly that these bodies themselves were having to react in a way which was, tracking the bleeding edge of these systems and then saying, okay, how do we assure it? And I think, and I give absolute credence to this, I think that it's been almost an impossible task. We've got, there was a period in particular between 23 and 24 where it felt like almost every month or every other week, some huge seismic event would take place in our ecosystem, new capacity. I mean, the generative models weren't around in anything like the way that we're talking about them when the EU did its first draft of its legislation. And then all of a sudden they had to kind of respond to general purpose systems. So this is where I think the analogy with cybersecurity comes in. I think the way that cybersecurity works is that you have like incidents or events, and then this has this huge implication on the industry. And then there is a solution, and then that cascades quickly across enterprises or companies writ large. And I think basically that kind of best practice becoming normalized is probably the way in which it's going to work. So we're going to see practical responses to things that just emerge. It's going to come from the academy. It's going to come from industry just responding. And then they're going to become the standards. I think it's going to actually flip on its head. I think best practice will become the de facto standard, because I'm not sure we can really do this in abstract,
Can I push back on you a little on that, on the cyber
Please,
analogy?
absolutely.
Um, Certainly, there's a lot of great technical capability in cybersecurity. But if you look, especially you look across enterprises, so
Yeah,
not just military, super high security kinds of contexts. Um, there's incident reporting. There are very good firms when you have a data breach that will go and clean things up. But at least what I see is we don't really see a race to the top. There's still many companies that are saying, okay, this is a cost of doing business.
yeah,
And they're not really adopting the best practices. It doesn't seem like the incentive structure is really there broadly enough. So if you're nodding your head, so if you agree with that, how does
yeah.
AI governance avoid that
Look,
fate?
so I agree. I'm not because I think the analogy with cybersecurity breaks down as well. It's just that I was just trying to make it in comparison to data
Right. Well, I think
governance.
it's a good
Uh,
analogy. It's your
yeah,
cybersecurity is not necessarily a positive model.
yeah, sure. Then so absolutely, I agree. So I can think in my mind, I can think of different categories where you'd have market motivations, and other categories where you would not have market motivations. And I think probably as we move forward, institutes like NIST and so on will probably have to work most aggressively on focusing on the areas where there isn't a market motivation for a company to behave in a particular or to govern in a particular way. But I'm talking about really basic stuff, like for example the hallucinations. I can just an immense market motivation to get that right.
You're
You
right.
know, bias. It's not people. I think fixate on biases in demographic terms, but we're talking about like algorithmic bias, like in terms of it's so a huge market motivation to get that right. You know, so I think there is enough. That's not the same in a lot of cybersecurity. Of course, it isn't. Whereas I think there are more powerful forces
Hmm.
in our industry, for sure.
What are you seeing right now with the companies that you talk to or that work with Holistic? What's motivating them? What are the biggest problems that they're bringing to you today?
I think it overwhelmingly. So my experience, and I'd love to know if it's analogous to yours, is or coherent with your experience. My experience was that in 23 and 24, there was this explosion of pilots, like a
Mhm.
huge amount of kind of speculative work, and I felt like at the start of 25, there was a kind of reckoning, which was, what's going on here? Where is the return on value on these systems? What are we actually seeing it? And we're starting to see more and more of this sense of reflecting a bit more and saying, okay, can we actually derive value from these systems? So there has been, I think we've moved past that pure experimentation phase. I don't think we saw the kind of productivity gains that the industry was hoping that it would have gained, but I don't think it was a wasted labor. I don't think it was wasted labor. I think that capital that was invested, both in terms of human labor and actual capital, I think it's gone into knowledge rather than production. And that means, it's almost like a J curve. So ultimately, I think now we're going to start to see the upside of it. So the kind of what we're seeing generally is a far higher level of maturity in terms of awareness of this problem. They've had some periods of experimentation, and now they're really keen to actually motivate and push this forward. So the distribution is usually actually a lot of companies are still using traditional machine learning systems. Then they've got a cohort of generative systems that have been quite reasonable and worked, and now they're really experimenting with agentic systems. Not generally not in production, but really keen to move in that direction. So that's the kind of distribution.
Yeah. How does that impact on their interest and commitment to AI governance?
Oh, I think it's the if part it, there's it. So what I'm finding is there are different constituents that are
Mhm.
concerned with AI governance.
Mhm.
So one of the constituents is whoever owns AI transformation in the business. All right. So fundamentally, they are responsible for for motivating this transformation, and governance is just central to that. For them to have a single pane view on the use of AI across the business, to be able to manage this, to be able to have a view on who's using this and who isn't using this. So, let's say that's a kind of AI governance as something that falls out of a technical track, which is just about AI transformation across the business. And of course, the second cohort is those very much motivated by compliance or policy, and saying, look, we really need to be on our brief on here. How are we going to be accountable? How can we document what we're doing? How can we ensure that we have sufficient audit trails and so on and so forth, anticipating the AI Act and other frameworks? So they're the two kind of general camps. I don't think the persona that owns this has solidified. Kevin, it's funny. I thought at the start of the decade in 2020, I thought by the middle of this decade, so last year, we would have settled on a lot of the core issues. Like, what does it mean for example, the documentation I thought would have been solved, and then I thought the second half of the decade would be codification of technical standards.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the market or the general space is still very indeterminate. We're starting to see the kind of repeatability in personas and so on, but actually it's still quite, it's still very, very dynamic.
Well, so what do you see from this vantage point of 2026? What do you think now we can expect in 2030 in this area?
Yeah, I do. I think we would have, in quotes, we would have solved the problem of productivity actually coming from these systems. So I don't think it's going to be, I think there was a thesis that copilot was the approach, which was every single person is supercharged with their own AI. I think it's more going to be, there's going to be some very, very powerful use cases. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see immense value from them. Mm-hmm. And that companies would have solved that. Like we would have been right now fully in our stride in that particular path. So I think it's probably not so much I'm talking about in the enterprises. It's not so much, I think, about the kind of transformation of every single person having a system, not the democratic model, as I call it. I think it's more the vanguard model of, companies are going to invest heavily in these, mission critical, probably agentic systems that are going to motivate huge change within the business. Mm-hmm. And the productivity will come from them. And the governance in that context is very different to the governance in the more generalized sense. So the more generalized sense, I think we'll continue to have the problem of shadow AI, who's using it, what are they doing, and so on. And then on the kind of more vanguard models, let's call them, or use cases, going to be very much red teaming and saying, okay, however deep we can go, let's go.
Mm-hmm. And how much can red teaming be automated and scaled, which presumably is essential, especially as we go to agentic models?
Yeah, so I think what we'll have is probably it's like an arms race. So it's funny. I guess one of the themes of this conversation is that I thought it was going to be the law versus tech, right? And as it's progressed, it seems to be tech versus tech. So I think what we're seeing is basically it's going to be the rate at which we're going to see innovation in AI is going to have to be mirrored and will be mirrored in the rate at which we're seeing innovation in governance. Hmm. I think for the long term, for the next half a decade, it's going to be impossible to play in this game without meaningful research capacity. So I just think it's going to be that's the direction in which we're going to be seeing this. We have to anticipate more and significant innovation in this space. It's not static. It's not that we just had the LLMs and then now we're responding to it. It's like every year something dramatic is taking place. So I think it's fundamentally going to be whoever's on the coalface of the research and the innovation in governance is going to be the only ones that can meaningfully govern these systems.
You mentioned early on that human oversight is no longer going to be viable or just as a simple concept. So then what replaces that serves the needs that people were talking about human oversight for?
So I do believe there will be human oversight, but I think it'll be at a different level of abstraction. So at the moment, I guess I'm trying to think about what the appropriate mental model would be. It's a bit like saying, we don't scan for planes using our eyes, right? We have radars, we have so on, and then we have somebody viewing the radar, right? So I see it like that. I think it's at a high level of abstraction. We'll see the kind of human oversight. It won't be on the every single system or somehow I think we're going to basically move towards AI governing AI. I think effectively that's what we're going to see. We're going to see an increase in automation and an increase in the use of things like guardian agents, sentinels, really quite areas which I thought, were a lot further away are actually closer than one imagines. So I think that's basically the paradigm we're moving towards, AI governing AI.
Which presumably makes your point about the need for research capability, because obviously you've got to build AI governance systems that don't have the same problems as the AI itself.
You got the problem of infinite regress, right? So like how does that system govern that system? How do we govern the system governing the system? How do you have confidence in that system and so on? And there's regimes in which you can do this, but absolutely, I have no doubt in my mind, and it's quite extraordinary because, as an entrepreneur, when you leave the academy, it's a completely different domain of expertise and incentive structure. But we seem to be in the most unique setting, Kevin, where like that research is driving, foundational research is still driving the market or the industry, which is an extraordinary thing. Two companies from our home institution, UCL, two companies just raised a significant amount of money. One raised 1.1 billion, the other raised 500 million. I think you probably saw the news recently. And for effectively labs, and that was quite striking for me, but it kind of makes sense, that still there's so much foundational work, and the kind of foundational work that is taking place is coming from research.
Although, we're going to need to wrap up after this. The challenge is when you have these applied companies, especially that have valuations where they're raising in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, then people who otherwise would be in academia and doing research increasingly are doing their work behind closed doors in organizations that are not necessarily publishing.
Yeah.
How do we get out of that dynamic?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know, because they are producing fantastic. There are companies producing fantastic work, and at the same time, exactly as you said. So, like, I noticed LeCun left Meta, right? And he's the classic example of somebody I would have expected to go properly back into the academy, but instead he basically raised another $1 billion. I think it was €1 billion or whatever it was, to set up another lab. So there is a whole conversation to be had about, what is taking place there. Can you do meaningful, purely speculative, interest-driven research in the context of a commercial entity? That's a greater question, if you will. But I do think, the US is the best model for this. We've got so many examples in the US of where fundamental and foundational innovation is taking place in industry. So this seems to be a unique dynamic, but I think that's an important question to ask.
Absolutely. Well, it's, as you say, a fascinating time in many ways. We could keep going for a long time, but we need to wrap up. Emre, thanks again. It's really great to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Kevin.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening. If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.